Well, hello, and welcome to another packed episode of Pod of the Gaps. I'm Andy Bannister, and I'm joined as ever by my partners in crime, or co-hosts, however they prefer to describe themselves, Michael Ots and Aaron Edwards. Hey guys, how are you doing today?
Good, thank you. Nice to be here. Nice to be with you, and nice to have my name correctly pronounced.
Yes, and yes, exactly. It's a bit of a running joke that we've only been doing this for 7 episodes now, and I still can't get Aaron's name right. But talking of names, though, it's exciting. We've this is the second episode in which we've actually got a proper name for the podcast. I still have to practice Pod of the Gaps. None of this nonsense about other silly names and asking people to vote. We're like a grown-up podcast now with a real name and everything.
On Apple Podcasts, and we're on Spotify yet?
Did get a message from a listener just today saying that they're very glad that we now have a name because we can actually get on with our podcasts rather than talking about it. Which we're failing
talking about
right now.
And talking about getting on with our podcast. I mean, obviously, to get on with a podcast, it's good to have everybody tuned in, dialed in and ready to record. But somebody whose name will go nameless, Michael Ots, kept Aaron and I waiting because you were out bike riding, dude. To go, there's an audience waiting for our engagement with culture, and you're pedaling around Buckinghamshire or something.
Yeah, well, I was I have a little hut up on a farm that I sometimes go and work in to get myself out the house, and I was honestly so engrossed in editing my new book that I completely forgot to track of time. So yes, I had to pedal rather fast down the hill to get home.
And for listeners who can't appreciate watching this, because we could see each other while we record this, but we don't inflict that on listeners. Michael is definitely trying to be quite kind of rustic, because not merely has he come from his hut on the farm, I can't really describe this. He's got like a bowl with dough and he's kneading it. He's literally making bread while recording a podcast. I've never seen that before. So
that's the modern man. That's the multitasking, in extremis, isn't it? He's podcasting.
It could go disastrously wrong. We're going to have the worst podcast and the worst loaf of bread that I've ever made.
Didn't we notice that when you were trying to post about the podcast, you were getting like 2 likes compared to like 85 likes for your bread? So your bread is clearly a better thing to do than the podcast. So I can see why you're trying to see.
You did suggest that maybe what I should do is just post about my bread, and then underneath in the comments I can tell people about the podcast, because that seems to be more popular.
Exactly. They'll think that they're going for bread and they'll find the podcast accidentally, which will be a great way.
Now, there is a link here, though. There is a link before we get into the kind of substance of the show that, dough, and of course dough is a euphemism for money in the UK. And to go, of course, now this podcast is up and running, it's actually costs a little bit to run. So just a kind of cheap sort of plug for folks who are watching this and tracking along and finding this helpful. In the show notes, wherever you're listening to this, you'll find a link to Patreon, which is a way where sort of, creators of things like podcasts and bread, presumably, and solicit donations. So if you were able to listen to this, you're loving the show, you're enjoying it, if we could get a few folk willing to even put £1 or $2, a few dollars a month behind it, it will make a huge difference, because we know I'll pick it up some costs for running this with all the kind of production stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So if you're enjoying Pod of the Gaps, just really encourage you, click through to the Patreon link, and would love you to get behind us, because we hope to make the show continue and covering all kinds of new topics.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Andy. I just cut you off when you were making a perfect segue. I was just saying, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I used to read blogs and see the little Patreon thing, or like, please contribute to my writing. If you like my writing, please pay me. I was thinking, why do you need to be paid to write a blog? It doesn't make sense. This person's presumably got a job, and they don't need the money to write. Why would someone need to? All of the blogs seem to have them, but then I didn't realize if you do proper blogging or podcasting, it actually does cost quite a lot of money for the platforms and the things to keep it secure and all the rest of it. So good plug.
That's right. There are costs. There are costs to these things, and Michael has to. We have to keep Michael in bread as well. But
clearly,
no, it doesn't cost much to run, but it does cost a bit. So that's So anyway, do a few appreciators click through. But today we have an excitingly packed show for you, and we thought we would explore the whole topic over the next 35-40 minutes today of the media, by which I mean particularly the news media. We looked at social media and kind of digital media on the previous show, but really now the kind of news media. And of course, we live in this kind of 24/7 news world, don't we? I mean, when I grew up, showing my age, it was really, you had like the 6 o'clock news and the 10 o'clock news, but nothing much in between. But now, of course, news has expanded to fill everything. And I remember first really becoming aware of this back when 9/11 happened, a couple of decades, whatever it is ago. And I remember sort of, literally sitting, watching news for almost 24 hours constant, hopping channels, trying to find different updates. And of course, everyone had the same stuff, so there wasn't anything. And when big crises come, I still catch myself doing this. Like I've really OD'd on news during COVID, and then there's been a lot of craziness going on in the politics in Scotland where I live. And I caught myself the other night at 11:30 p.m, iPhone out, hopping between 3 or 4 different news sites, hitting refresh, pulling Twitter up. Was there anything new? And I caught myself going, "What the heck are you doing, Bannister?" And this 24/7 constant news thing has changed a lot. I think one of the things it's brought distraction, and one of the things it's done is take away reflection time. Or at least I find that. Am I alone? Do you guys find the same thing? Is that a problem? And how do we respond, particularly as Christians, to a world that seems to be moving ever faster, with ever less time to reflect on what we're being told?
I will say you're not alone in thinking regularly, what the heck are you thinking, Bannister? I mean, Michael and I regularly have that thought and try to.
Thanks for that. Thank you.
But I mean, I think one of the things I would say is not just an inability to reflect and a continual kind of distraction, but I'd also say in terms of people's mental health, like increasing levels of anxiety. It's just not healthy when you're kind of reading a 24/7 kind of COVID newsfeed. I mean, we used to get it like, kind of happen for a day or two when a big news event happened and then they would stop it. Like, we feel like we've had one that's basically been going on for over a year now, and it's just continually going on. And I mean, some helpful advice just on a very practical level that I had early on in the pandemic was just saying, just once a day, get your news and then switch it off. Like anything major, you'll hear about it, but like we don't actually need to know that all the time. It's a bit like we were saying last week with social media. It's there to just try and keep your attention, but it's not like I'm going to miss anything if I kind of turn off for a few hours.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense. You're right, and as you said too, Andy, the distractedness can become a significant issue spiritually as well, can't it? Because it detracts your attention to lesser objects of, I guess, contemplation. And I think there's something about, I think we mentioned a bit last week as well, the need to recover something of the ascetic mindset, which we just do not get in the West today. We constantly mock the idea of a monk in a monastery or something, which was quite significant, well, still is a significant tradition in the church, but was far more significant in previous eras where it was recognized that there's an importance of withdrawing for a particular purpose, not just because you don't like the world or you don't like the systems, or you don't like people, and you just want to pray on your own in a cloister. It's actually that there's a need to withdraw. It's like fasting. There needs to be a kind of discipline and saying, I'm just choosing not to give myself to this. I'm choosing to contemplate what ought to be contemplated, which is primarily God and who he is, and then his acts in the world. And then from that basis, from that worshipful place, I can make better decisions and I can have a clearer perspective.
I wonder as well, as you say that, whether there's also, I mean, the things you say there, Michael, I completely agree with. I also, and Aaron, sorry as well. I also wanted something. I was listening. I was listening. I was looking at Michael and the bread. That's why I said Michael when it was Aaron who spoke.
The bread is very distracting. It is distracting.
Kneading away to making loaves. The thing that I think is interesting, on the one hand, we could just talk about the distraction kind of stuff, but I think there is also something sort of more insidious going on. And as Christians, it's not enough, I think, just to be negative, but we need to begin by diagnosing it. And one of the books I want to come back to throughout the show a little bit as a touch point is a phenomenal book for folks who haven't read it called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. Came out in the mid-1980s, talking about television and the impact it's having on attention. And everything he wrote then is even more true in the digital age. And he's got some very helpful stuff on news media. And one of the things that Postman says in that book, and I think it was interesting, Aaron, that you said you hadn't read it, but you've read so many quotes of it, you've almost read it, because it's been so talked about. It just so turned the world upside down. But for listeners, if you haven't read it, do check it out. Right in the introduction, he makes a very interesting contrast between George Orwell, who wrote the book 1984, and Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, both dystopian novels. And lots of people talk about 1984 and the kind of Big Brother type stuff. But Postman's point is that actually Huxley was onto something more relevant. And just read you this little paragraph, and I just love, perhaps both of you to sort of reflect a bit. He says, what Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was there was no reason to ban a book, because there'd be nobody who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much information we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. And I reread that this afternoon, and I thought, man, I mean, it's very, very hard to disagree with that actually the sheer sea of stuff has an effect. Almost, I wonder if it's an intentional effect, actually, sort of dumbing folks down, making it impossible to really engage with some of the big issues because there's just no framework to do it in. And we have literally, amused ourselves to death because the news in many ways functions as entertainment these days. Maybe I'm being deeply pessimistic. I do live in Scotland. Am I? Or what's your thoughts?
Just a few things that immediately come to mind on that. The interesting, as I said, I've not read the book, Postman's book, but I feel like I have. One of the books that I read, some reflection on what he was saying, was by a book by Stanley Hauerwas, where he was talking about this problem of the world we live in as having been created by television. And of course, Postman is reflecting on that in the 80s. But I think you said, Andy, his son, was it, who wrote the forward to
this one,
in 2006, was it? And it shows how relevant his thought still is in the digital age. And that's the thing that Hauerwas was reflecting on. We literally live in a world that television has created. So it's not that we live in a world and then we've sat down and watched television in our leisure time. It's that our engagement with that media literally has a direct effect on the actual ideas and things that happen in the world. And we don't really think that's true. We don't really believe that's true. But that's part of the whole conceit. That's where the dystopian reflection that you allude to is really true. I think Rod Dreher does similar. I think he possibly even quotes that very quotation in Live Not by Lies as well, which I guess we'll discuss when we eventually talk about Dreher, which is interesting. But it makes me think of another novel from probably nearly 20 years ago. Was it 20 years ago? A bit less than that. 2006, I think. It was by David Mitchell, not the comedian, but the author. It was a brilliant author, a contemporary author. He wrote a book called Cloud Atlas, which was later made into a film that wasn't so good, but not bad, but the book was amazing. And in it, he has a kind of dystopian section within this epic novel where all of the people in it are given credits that they have to keep spending. It's a kind of consumerist dystopia where they have to, if you don't spend your credits, you actually get in trouble. So it keeps you constantly spending and constantly distracted so that you can't deal with the fact that you're being entirely controlled by this kind of massive corporation. And I think there's a lot of, clearly Mitchell's making that kind of critique of our consumerist age. And I think a lot of it does track in from the Postman analysis as well, of the kind of world we live in and the dangers that are there. So I don't think you're wrong, Andy, at all at seeing the dangers of the distraction and the dystopic ways that people have interpreted. I think the Huxley thing is bang on. The soma that the people in that world have to take is entirely there to distract them from seeing the true thing, the true reality, and thinking actually that what they have is good. This is something that Dreher talks about as well in China, for example, the kind of younger generations who are not really aware of how much of their privacy is given away by their investment in all of these media platforms, because they don't care, because it's so convenient for them to keep doing what they're doing and the access they have to everything at their fingertips. They don't care that the police could literally be watching them at any moment, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Now, in some ways, I was going to segue to Michael. Unless you wanted to add something to that, just to say that, I mean, all of that could be quite depressing. But then how do we live in the light of that, Michael? How do we avoid just getting depressed and sitting in a corner and crying? As Christians, I love the way you put that there, Aaron. We live in a world that TV and digital culture has made. How on earth, as Christians, do we live authentically in the light of that? Neither just going with the flow, nor just standing in a corner, either crying or just yelling in anger. How do we engage well?
I guess part of it starts with just thinking about it, doesn't it? If we're aware of what the media is doing, if we're aware of some of the challenges and the dangers, just like we said last week with social media, in a sense, you can then start to think about, I think we use the terminology, using it rather than being used by it. And that might be helpful, So for me, one of the things is just to think, okay, well, actually, what I see represented on the BBC News feed isn't necessarily the sum total of what's really important happening in the world right now. And actually, and this is a question I wanted to kind of bring up, to what extent is the media reporting the news, but also to what extent is the media creating news that it wants to create? How much is it setting the agenda? Because there's so much stuff that is happening that gets very little airtime, and yet it's really, really important. Now, for me, one example of that will be the kind of ongoing situation in Belarus. It's a country, it's within our own continent. There's massive kind of political unrest, instability in the country. There's been protests that have been going on for months. And yet, despite that, very little kind of attention in the British media compared to other things. And yet, I'd say that's pretty important. Now, I'm slightly biased because I've got friends in the country and I care about it. But it's just one example of how actually, in terms of levels of importance, obviously part of that is dependent by geography, stuff that's close to us, the stuff that happens in America and Western countries will get kind of higher levels. But I think as a Christian, I want to say if I'm going to be a global Christian, I'm not to kind of make my hierarchy of importance the same as the BBC's. Just because it's not happening in a Western country or in Britain doesn't mean I shouldn't care about it. So maybe I need to seek out news that isn't going to be at the top of the agenda in certain feeds, but actually make myself aware of stuff, because that's also important.
It's amazing.
I think that's very interesting.
Sorry,
go on, Aaron.
I was just going to say, it's amazing how much news has become politicized in that way, isn't it? And yet many people don't realize how controlled it is by the platforms, by the media by which we hear the news. We often think of the media as the ones who that they're really just the medium. They are the ones who bring us the news. And we often trust that the platforms are doing so objectively, but they're obviously not. It's very political. There's so many ways in which there's bias involved in various sort of platforms. And it's a really tricky one to sort of, to work out.
I think just on that, one little thing, in terms of the media creating news, it struck me a while back when the current Archbishop of Canterbury was, enthroned in whatever.
Installed.
Installed.
That's boilers, isn't it? Install boilers, you enthrone a bishop.
Does he want to be a boiler or a king? I don't know. But anyway, when he became the Archbishop of Canterbury, it was interesting because the BBC did an interview with him and kind of repeatedly asked him questions about controversial issues around sexual ethics. And then they made that the headline news, Archbishop speaks out on blah, blah, blah. And it was no, actually, you asked him the question and now you've created the headline. It's nothing to do with what's actually happened news-wise today, but you asked a question so you could create a headline that fitted your agenda. And you think, how often does that happen?
And the thing is that raises it. Sorry, Andy, this is like the episode where we just keep cutting you off. There's something about the media.
No, I'm going to press ahead now. I just go over you now, because the great thing is we take it in turns as the host, so I'm just going to press the mute button. No, I just pick up something Michael said there, because one of the things that intrigued me with that is actually when Christians do get sort of hijacked by the media, whether we've bought into the whole it's the media, it's the BBC, we need to engage. And I remember, I think it was last week when we were sort of prepping this episode out, I told you guys the story when I lived in Canada for 6 years. And early on in my time in Canada in 2010, I met a very well-known kind of pastor in the town. I won't mention his. I got permission to share the story, but I'm not sure if he wants his name shared. Pastor of a huge actually church in Toronto, about 5,000 people. But we shall narrow it down to a dozen or so leaders. And this was around the time Canada had just gone through the whole gay marriage thing, and been a big civic debate, and national debate, and they'd legalized it. But during that debate, he'd got rung up by the CBC, which is the Canadian equivalent of the BBC, and said, would you come on this big, quite well-known in Canada news program, because we want to debate on gay marriage, should it be legalized? My friend had been announced and been around the block a few times, so he had the ability to say he said to the researcher, potentially yes. He said, of course, if I come on the show, what I'd want to do is I want to sort of pull the camera back, talk a bit of other sort of philosophy and the history behind this debate. Certainly want to talk about the ontology of marriage, what Christians believe marriage is, and really just set a much bigger context in which we could think about this question, and it's ethics. He said, so is that the kind of thing you're looking for? He said there was a bit of silence on the other end of the phone. He said, or are you looking for a Christian who can come on who you guys can paint to be the right-wing reactionary and basically make fun of for 20 minutes? And the researcher, he said, laughed. And he said, the researcher said to him, you've almost quoted exactly the briefing notes I've got from my producer. That's what we need. He went, well, I'm afraid I'm not going to be that person. Thank you for calling. He said, sad thing was he tuned in 2 days later. They'd found another pastor who'd been willing to go on. And that's exactly what they did. They manipulated it, they framed him, they set him up to look like the idiot and the homophobe and everything else. And this poor pastor got his reputation totally trashed, but because he got drawn to the glitz. And I wonder whether as Christians we still have a tendency to get drawn to the glitz of the media a bit. And hence, it'd been interesting if the Archbishop had turned around and gone, actually, no, I'm not interested. Thanks very much. I've got a church to run.
Yeah, that's a really good. That's a very good point. I think it's consecrated, the term. I can't remember. Maybe it is for Archbishop. Anyway, I think that's a really good story. Well, good story. A sort of tale of caution, really.
Tale of woe.
Christians. Tale of woe and caution for the media, because I do think it's tempting, isn't it? Whenever you get an opportunity like that, to want to take it, because you're always going to see the good and go, how can it be? I think we talked about this with the platform building thing. How could it be a bad thing for me to do this? I can remember talking similarly to a pastor in Aberdeen when I was up in your neck of the woods, Andy, for a few years, and he was asked again. They were one of the churches that were refusing. This wasn't for gay marriage, of course. It was for whether you could have gay ministers in the Church of Scotland. And again, they wanted someone from that church to go and speak on the media. And he said, no, absolutely not. I know exactly how it will be. I've seen this before. It will be, I'll give a nuanced response and they will quote me in a very short segment and then pit me against someone else and say what I've said as though it's a response to someone else talking about their emotional hurt, how the church has hurt them, how they want to express themselves. And then they'll have me talking about Leviticus or something as part of a wider discussion. And that's clearly how these things work. And they need to make great, exciting TV. And really, they're not interested in the truth. Similar, like on Question Time. Is it still called Question Time? Or is it called something else? The Sunday morning one. Oh, so yeah. Often you see that. And I've had friends who've been invited. I think I got an invite to go to that fairly recently. Again, it's something that you think you're not really going to get a chance to speak. You can see that they're only after a little bit of fodder for about 15 seconds or something. And then you're done. You can't, I can't interrupt the host like I can here, clearly, with the same frequency, and so you just don't get to say what you need to say. And I think I've heard Don Carson, another Canadian, in fact, say the same thing. He's often refused. I think he's regularly refused opportunities to speak on big networks because he hasn't got the opportunity to speak with authority, with a kind of, I'm speaking on behalf of the word of God here. This is what the case is, and you're going to let me speak, like you can in a pulpit. You just clearly aren't going to get that time. Other pastors clearly, I think John MacArthur regularly would speak on Larry King's show in the States, and often had a quite good airtime. So there's different situations where maybe you can get a better hearing. And Larry King was someone who was a bit better at allowing the people to speak from their perspective. But still, I think it's a real minefield, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, here's another minefield. If we stepped on, we've tiptoed around some landmines or cycled around them in Michael's case, while kneading dough. And here's another totally non-controversial question that's not going to get us into trouble with any parts of the Christian community at all. And that's the question of, given this, what we've said about the news media, and I think it's just beset with problems. And yes, you can navigate it wisely once you're aware of those, if you're very, very careful. Is there a tendency or a pattern in some parts of the church that we end up aping and copying the news media? But I mean, for example, I came across the story of a Christian magazine. I won't mention which one, although of course the frightening thing is you could probably Google it and find out to which I'm referring. Which had on its cover, a while ago, on the cover had this story: top 10 tips for getting closer to God, with a kind of big jazzy headline, which is totally mimicking, the way that so many sort of trashy magazines, 5 tips for making sourdough while live on air, 3 cures for nostril hair or something. And as somebody said, commenting on that, just looks like religion mimicking MTV. And so does Christian media at times, because this often happens in the church, I worry that at times we look at what the culture's doing and actually we don't stop and reflect. Rather we go, oh, that's the way to do it. And we just copy it. So we talked about this last week on the social media episode, but I wonder, is this a danger in Christian media, do you think? We don't need to name any names.
I find it slightly ironic that we're talking about it, given that before we came into this, we were discussing about whether we need to make our podcast titles slightly more catchy and sexy because people weren't clicking on them. But that's kind of the point, isn't it?
It is, isn't it?
We talk about clickbait. I mean, like, the idea of like, you just get people to kind of click on. I guess there's like a balance, isn't there, between on the one hand, like, not kind of writing headlines in Christian magazines that sound like a Puritan book cover. We probably want to be a bit more...
What's wrong with
Puritan book covers?
I mean, they're very, like...
They are the title. The cover is the title. That's how long the title is. It
exactly. I mean, you don't actually need the book because you've got it all in the title. So that's on one extreme, but then on the other, there's the kind of clickbait, and I don't know about you, but like, when you're scrolling through social media and you succumb to clickbait, and you're just like, and the thing is, like, it's so disappointing, isn't it? Because you just feel like, oh, and it's like you drag through like all this stuff, and it's like, why am I doing this? Like,
you need to read my blog post, 6 reasons why you shouldn't click on articles on social media.
So yeah, I mean, I think like we do want to be engaging. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, there's nothing wrong with being provocative in a good sense. But I guess it's a question of motive behind that. If it's just trying to unnecessarily grab people's attention for the sake of grabbing people's attention, then that's what. And I guess that's maybe one thing to think as a Christian. I've often thought there's a danger in, as Christians, particularly with like social media and lockdown and like content building, someone said, as Christian ministers, we've gone from feeding the flock to creating content. Yeah. And there's that danger that we feel this kind of urge, we've just got to keep saying stuff because we've got to kind of put more and more stuff out there. And, I'd like to think, like on the podcast, if we didn't feel like we had anything to talk about, we don't need to do one. Like we've always said, like we'll do one each week while we've got stuff to talk about. But at the same time, we don't have to feel the need to just kind of keep beating a horse.
Or we just feel that we can just fill the airtime with talk about inane things like sourdough and podcast.
Right. Yeah.
The piece you mentioned, the thing you mentioned there though, Michael, does connect to something interesting there, doesn't it? Also, because all these things connect, and it was interesting, as I was doing a bit of prep, because when I host the conversation, I spend a couple hours prepping. I know you guys just wing it because that's and I like about sort of 15 different questions, and they all kind of interconnect.
Should we ask the listeners if they can tell?
No, that's why it's annoying that he's being interrupted, because he's done so much work and we keep interrupting.
That's exactly it. So I got these questions, I'm done while getting through them. So if it takes 3 hours on the show, so but the piece that you mentioned there, though, Michael, does connect to another theme, doesn't it? It connects to the whole monetization thing. Because I think one of the things that Postman, in using ourselves to death, talks about is, of course, that news has segued and become entertainment. And the very fact that, things we just take for granted, the fact that a news bulletin, if you watch a TV news bulletin, starts with music. Why the heck does it start with music? That's what you do at the start of a film or a TV serial. Why do we need to do that for a news bulletin? It's framing it as entertainment. Then the fact that the news is broken up with advertising and online stuff is a nightmare for this, right? I don't know if you guys find this. It drives me potty that, whichever source I'm on, whether I go to, The Guardian, The Telegraph, BBC News obviously doesn't happen because it's funded through taxation, but almost everywhere else is like advert everywhere, which is why they want to get your eyeballs on things. And obviously, I'm presuming that monetization does risk skewing things to some degree, right? Because to go the old adage of follow the money, and if stories that attract more eyeballs are going to bring more advertising revenue, and then the media source is going to do more of those, and the same applies in the Christian world, I suspect.
Yeah. Well, obviously, Andy, we've got to remember that at this point in the podcast, we are contractually obliged to mention Michael Ots' sourdough business. So please tune in for the 30-second infomercial about how you too can become a great sourdough maker whilst
All I can say to that is baguettes behind me, Satan. That's what I'll say to that.
Exactly. I think you're right. It's a huge kind of issue to be aware of. I'm also conscious, actually thinking about what you're saying about the way in which Christians can't, need to have our kind of wits about us about how we're involved and how we mustn't allow those things to shape us too much. I think, similar to when we talked about the church and culture in general, we've gotten so used to just following the pattern, allowing those ads or the world we're immersed in to shape us, and we're drinking it, we're breathing in the air. And we're so quick to think we're always doing this savvy cultural engagement, and we really don't realize how much we're being malformed by the culture, and being conformed to this world rather than transformed by the renewal of our mind. I was thinking, for an example, recently, I had an example of someone wanting to promote this quite prominent event. I'm now going to, maybe you guys have promoted it, and maybe you'll be annoyed at me now, but it's called Sermon of the Year. And quite a few, Christian media outlets like to sort of promote this. And it's in Britain. It's clearly based on a secular mode of giving someone credit for something. And so, what's so bad about this? We're getting people to preach their best sermon, to come along, and then there's judges who look at it. It's kind of almost like a pop idol style thing, but for sermons. And there's lots of people. There's Bible colleges that promote it. I had it sent round to us at Cliff College. I said, we cannot promote that. Partly because I literally spend a couple of my preaching lectures that I do on the preaching course denouncing that exact thing. And I think I actually have a slide where I have a kind of screenshot of that as being an example of how.
Hey, if there's a Catholic version of that, they could call it Pope Idol. I just had to get that joke in there to go. It was just so obviously. So,
exactly.
Which again, I guess, is the aping the culture thing. So I think we've been going for about half an hour, and we've done some diagnosis on things. I'd love to sort of think about a bit how we engage a little bit, because obviously I think the whole aim of the podcast is to help Christians think about some of these things and begin thinking more about these things. Half the challenge is, until you're aware of them, you can just sort of swim along with the current before realizing, man, there's an issue here. And we were discussing before we hit record. There's a quote attributed. Well, we're debating whether this is Spurgeon, Charles Spurgeon, or Karl Barth. So we discovered a bit of Googling, because of course that's how we do research these days, that actually it was an idea that Spurgeon articulated and then Karl Barth put into a more pithy soundbite, which is the idea of when you, as a Christian, when you pray, or if you're a pastor, when you preach, that you should kind of do that with the Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other, so that you have your eye on the Word of God, but you're also thinking about how this applies into the culture. And I'm just intrigued. I think that's a lovely idea. Does it still work? Do we need to adjust it slightly for the modern kind of media kind of world? Can we just pray with the Bible in one hand and BBC News open in the other? Is it a good way of staying engaged as we pray and we preach? What do folks think? Does it still stand up?
Oh, sure. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't want to talk too much. I will.
Hasn't stopped you so far, Aaron. Hasn't stopped you so far.
The host can't even stop me. Well, you can mute me, actually. Yeah, the media mogul can mute me. Yeah, so I think it is a really important quote. It's probably not. It wouldn't be surprising if Barth had come up with it separately to Spurgeon. I'm not sure Barth read Spurgeon. But he wouldn't have had contact with him. Other German theologians of the time did, like Thielicke wrote a whole book on Spurgeon. I don't think Barth did. Either way, they both had similar concerns of bringing the word.
I love the fact that you know the name of every major German theologian. I mean, it's just so impressive.
and whether or not they'd read Spurgeon.
Well, I mean,
just admiring your useless knowledge there. But yeah,
we've got to spend our time doing something.
He's making sourdough on a podcast, so.
That's right. Yeah, we're both charged with the same pointless brush in a way. At least you can eat the product of yours. I can't do anything with my Thielicke knowledge.
Well, of course, just an aside, there is the old joke, isn't there, about what's the difference between a theologian and a large loaf of sourdough? A large loaf of sourdough can feed a family of 4. Sorry, Aaron. You were saying I interrupted you twice. That is true.
No, that's fine. You're getting your own back. How do you know I'm making serious points? No. So basically, interestingly, they both wanted to, Spurgeon and Barth, bring the word of God into the present moment. That was a real key concern. Both of them did it in different ways. Barth, interestingly, had this, and he's a great Swiss theologian, German-speaking theologian. He had a time earlier in his ministry where he was a preacher. He was a preacher before he was a theologian, which is always a good thing. Where he wrote this sermon once, or preached a sermon called the Titanic Sermon, which was sort of and he sort of repented of it in later years as a kind of how to go wrong in preaching is probably what he was doing. Where he basically was so enraptured by the news of the Titanic going down in 1912 he spent virtually the entire sermon talking about the details of the ship, how profound this event was. And in reading the sermon, it's fascinating because it's exactly like what we do today. We're enraptured by the present moment. And he came to look back at it after and say, this is just ridiculous. I was just literally really enraptured by what I'd read in the news. And it engulfed the sermon. He said something about a psalm right at the end. There was hardly any element of this being an exposition of the word of God. And that taught him. He did the same. Throughout the First World War, he struggled with the same thing. Endless details about what he's hearing about the war. And an old woman came up to him in the congregation, just a sweet old lady, and said, please, I hear enough about the war and think about it most of the week. I want, when I come to church on a Sunday morning, to hear some good news, so something different. And that really sort of, led him in a way to think very differently about what the point of preaching is. And I don't just mean preaching in a pulpit on a Sunday. We can say, okay, well, not everyone gets to do that, but all Christians have a platform of some variety. They can all speak words of life to those around them, especially on media platforms. And I think, what do we want to give people? Are we going to be so saturated in the media, so engrossed by the clickbait, as you say, and what seems to be shiny at the time? Or are we going to actually think, can we give someone something of substance? Like Michael, you said earlier, the creating content. It's just funny, isn't it? So often, because we're obsessed with creating content, we don't have much content. We don't actually have any, we don't have much substance behind it. And I think people want to hear that Christians have something worth saying, and we're not going to get that by only. So yes, we have the Bible in one hand, newspaper in the other, but not to the extent where we're really gravitating to the newspaper as the exciting thing and finding a passage to tag on to the end to show that we're a little bit relevant. Interestingly, C.S. Lewis, who was incredibly influential as an apologist, evangelist, and writer and academic in his generation, he hardly ever read the news or watched the news. I don't know if you could watch the news. They didn't have TV. The TV had not created itself then, or the world then, as it does now. But Lewis didn't hardly spend any time engaging with the news. And his friends thought this was scandalous because he was like a public intellectual, someone who's speaking into everyday issues. So he said, I just find it's a waste of time. I'd rather read significant things that are going to help me speak to real issues that people are going through. And he was able to speak to real people. It didn't require constant references to what were the latest drama going on in order to do it.
The interesting thing with that, and then sorry, Michael, I'll jump to you, is that I thought it's a very helpful reflection. But the other thing as well, I think with that, I love the sentiment. I've often quoted it, but I also wonder whether we're, because we live in this age now where everything is clickbait and interlinked. One of the things I've personally discovered. I love the news. I'm a news junkie. I have to really be careful around that. I want to be engaged. But I tend to sort of, during the week at least, certainly, get up about 6 a.m. in the morning, cup of tea, before the kids get up, read my Bible, pray, that kind of thing. And I've caught myself, particularly in the last few months during COVID, when I was in news junkie season, I would get up, put the kettle on, and before then taking my cup of tea into the lounge and going to read my Bible, I would open my iPhone and I'd read the news headlines. And I've had to stop myself doing that because it's total distraction. Exactly as you say there, that is then in your head as you're reading scripture. And sometimes, if I'm honest, it would work well that the passage I was reading of scripture reflected on what I'd read. But more often I found it the other way around, that I'm thinking more about the news than I am about the piece of scripture I'm reading. And so now just changing that activity and going, no, now I make a cup of tea and I don't open the phone, or try not to open the phone before I've read the Bible and prayed. And then later I'll read the news because I love reading the news. But just putting things the right way around, I think, could be helpful. But sorry, Michael, you were going to say something.
No, there's three things that came to my mind. Firstly, just back on what Aaron was saying, if I'm allowed, I'll keep going until I get interrupted or I hesitate, deviate, or repeat. But talking about Lewis, it's interesting because Lewis obviously was steeped in reading literature from previous generations. And I think I can't remember the quote now, but he basically says, if you only read stuff that's happening immediately around you, you'll be blind to the errors around you. And it's only actually by reading outside of your culture, outside of your generation, that you'll see that. And this came home to me kind of earlier in the last year, when kind of the Black Lives Matter protests were going on and people were kind of discussing kind of political issues revolving around that in terms of kind of progressive, kind of left-wing politics and so on. It's interesting because I was reading the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which is a massively long read. It's 24 hours in the audiobook and the abridged edition. But actually reading this book that was written completely outside of this kind of particular context that we were in gave me a perspective on what was happening and some of the things that were happening, which I wouldn't have got if I just read the news. And it kind of made me realize that, like, there is we talked about last week with social media, the danger of kind of like, it's a lot easier to read tweets and kind of soundbite headlines. It's a lot harder to sit and read, an extended book. But actually, it's only when we do that kind of stuff that we'll have something to be able to engage with what's happening around us. So I think being able to learn lessons from previous generations or maybe other cultures, so actually we can speak and not just regurgitate what's happening in the news, but have something more interesting to say.
Yeah, that's really.
No, I was just going to say on that. I guess if I'm a pastor who's preaching expositionally week by week, I think there's a real danger that I would then start with the news and try and squeeze a Bible passage to kind of comment on it. And actually, if we really dig into Scripture, one of the things I've loved when I've preached expositionally for a local church in the past has been just digging into a passage of Scripture that you think has absolutely no relevance to the world as it is today. And then as you really understand it, thinking, oh, wow, this does speak, but it speaks with a greater power, because you're not trying to squeeze it to say what you want it to say. You're actually just finding out what it's saying and then seeing that because it's Scripture and God breathed, it's relevant. Whereas I think there is a scope potentially for, maybe in a kind of topical apologetic sense, sometimes taking a current topical issue and then speaking into it. I wouldn't want that every Sunday as part of my diet as a Christian, but I think there's an opportunity in the kind of secular world, particularly, to speak as Christians in that way.
It goes into the issue, like I was saying earlier, about the where do we get how do we give people stuff of substance, isn't it? And it's funny that Lewis, the quote you're mentioning about I think he has a rule, doesn't he? For every new book you read, you should read 2 old books, or maybe every two new books you have to read 1 old book to balance yourself out. And he wrote that as a kind of introduction to a book on Athanasius's book, on the Incarnation. So a kind of one of the early church fathers, and this is his muse, him having to introduce, why should you care about what Athanasius wrote? Centuries and centuries ago. This is why you should care, because it's incredibly important. There's a reason why books are classics. They're classics because they've stood the test of time, and they're not just things that people are excited about in the moment. Like, how many books are published today that no one at all will care about? How many things that we spend our time thinking about, invested in, no one's going to care about? And he's just showed a picture of his new book. But that will be one that does stand the test of time, of course. But the point that Lewis is really making on it is actually that it's not that older generations are somehow always better. It's not that old is better, because there's loads of stuff in the older generations which will also have been off the moment and not worth it. It's that also that when you immerse yourself in another place, like you did with Solzhenitsyn, Michael, it can give you a perspective on your generation that your generation doesn't have. You've got your own perspective on that generation, the previous one. I think I know what's wrong with some of those from my perspective, but I don't know what's wrong with my generation. My generation doesn't know. We need these other voices from the past to speak in, because they have wisdom to share.
I think that's really helpful. I think actually, I mean, I love that passage of Lewis that you mentioned, and I think it's also the metaphor from memory he talks about is, if you read old books, it's like you allow the fresh breezes of the ages to kind of blow through it, exactly as you say there, Aaron, to go that, our culture makes mistakes, but the mistakes we make are different to a culture in the past. And just in the same way, actually, it's reading old books and engaging with older stuff, in some ways it's similar to living in another culture. If you had the privilege of living somewhere else, we loved our time in Canada because we came back to the UK, we saw things that I don't think we'd have seen if we hadn't lived in another culture. I know when we were over there, we saw things in Canadian culture that our Canadian friends are like, I never thought about that. Because if you have that 2 culture perspective, I think reading does the same. But look, I'm conscious of the time. So one last thing I wanted to just sort of talk about as we try to draw some threads together here. And I think, I love where we've brought this into land on thinking about what we know, in a sense, what we shape ourselves with. And I think last week we had at the back of our conversation that Romans 12 passage about be renewed be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And the idea, of course, what you bring into your mind and what you read and think about you are going to end up molding yourself around it. So this is not just casual stuff. We need to think carefully about this. But the other thing that occurred to me, I was on a Scottish hill walk last weekend. The sun shone in Scotland, and so a good buddy and I, we're privileged here that we can get out and get away from lockdown stuff, because just up the road got some great hills. So a lovely hill walk up a Scottish valley, talking about this show that we were planning on recording, because he listens to this. And one of the things that came up in our conversation, he said, one of the things that disturbs me, he said, about media is how much it's just all bad news. He said, the whole clickbait thing that we've talked about, why is it that bad news stuff sells? The BBC, the Telegraph, the Guardian, whoever it is, left, right, centre, whatever it is, nobody leads generally with a good news kind of story. Even if there is a good news story, they'll find a way of spinning it. So, like vaccination numbers are up, but they'll find a way of going, oh yeah, but there's this issue. And there's always this spin. And as Christians, we should have a question there, of course, because we are people to whom good news should matter for somewhat obvious reasons. So I suppose, what do we think about that? How can we perhaps change the discourse slightly? Are there ways of encouraging, of being people who, perhaps in the stuff that we share on social media, that when there are rare occasions of good news, perhaps we magnify things better, perhaps the way that we talk, we try and find, stuff that is good and noble and beautiful that we can also be sharing, but also, are there ways as we talk about news and engage in a world of news that we find a way of talking about the good news? Because, of course, Christianity is at its heart not a piece of advice, it's a piece of news, right?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, loads of good
I set you up as an evangelist for that. If you can't, as an evangelist, Michael, say something off the back of that, then you should go into baking.
It's something I've been really thinking about, because thinking back over the kind of pandemic, really, and thinking about how that's been reported, one of the things I was feeling was generally the left-wing media I felt was being very kind of scaremongering in terms of like COVID, itself. And it was like, this is terrible, we're all going to die, it's going to be awful, like, panic. And then someone said, yes, but the right-wing media also do that, but just for different things. It's like, the economy is going to crash, we're not going to have any jobs, we're all going to die. And it was like, everyone's panicking. And this is the thing, like, if you're on the left, you panic about one thing. If you're on the right, you panicked about another. And I was thinking, what should mark us out as Christians? Well, according to Peter in his letter, it should be that we're people of hope, because people are going to ask us about the hope that we have.
Yeah.
So in a world that is, left and right panicking like mad for different dystopian futures that they're imagining, like actually as Christians, we've got the hope of the new creation. And, it's not a kind of like, everything's going to go back to normal by the summer, or like the roadmap is necessarily going to come to fruition in the way that Boris hopes it does. But it's bigger than that, isn't it? We've got a much, much bigger hope as Christians that we want to hold out to a world that is panicked and is despairing. And you not just COVID, you can look at that. I've been thinking about the environment recently, and so much of environmental concern, which is right, is driven by a motive which is based on fear. And again, as Christians, I want to say, like, absolutely, we should be caring for the environment, but not from a basis of fear, like Greta Thunberg, I want you to panic, but a sense of hope. God loves this world that he created and is going to redeem it one day. And therefore we can get involved with a sense of purpose, because we know that our labor in the Lord is not in vain, whatever that labor is. So I think for me, it's reading widely, not expecting the answer to be, if I read in the left, not thinking, well, the right's going to have the answer. If I read right wing, the left's got the answer. As a Christian, there'll be bits of left and right, political media that I'll identify with, and there'll be bits that I won't. But the gospel's more than just identifying with left and right, or one news channel, the Telegraph over the Guardian, or vice versa. It's saying actually we're privy to news that is not being reported, and yet we want to report. We want to make this known, and let's use this as an opportunity to speak with hope and with grace and with joy into a situation which is pretty bleak.
Yeah, that's right. It's really funny that off the back of that, what Andy was saying as well earlier there about the fact that we're defined by the good news, and the fact that the gospel, we come to refer to the gospel without realizing the root word that gospel just mean. The root of it is actually just a good news that needs to be announced, like an announceable good news, the evangelion. And the way that Paul even it's funny how Paul in his epistles will often say my gospel in a way that would be really weird. It'd be really weird if Michael Ots stood up at an evangelistic crusade in Antigua. It wouldn't be weird that he's in Antigua, but it'd be weird that he was standing up saying, this is my gospel that I bring to you. But then you forget, of course, that that's a word that was used. Evangelion is a term that was actually used for good news, and he's appropriating a term that is in existence for the gospel, and making it into the definite article. We have the good news, and we need to proclaim that. So when he gets into all of this stuff about in 1 Corinthians, for example, where death, where is your victory, where is your sting on the resurrection? It's incredible. It's incredible news. It's the most. I've never done sort of evangelistic stuff on the resurrection, as I'm sure you both have numerous times, I'm often pointing to the fact that the resurrection is the most incredible news you could ever hear, ever. Like, there's literally nothing more conceivably amazing to hear than that Jesus rose from the dead. There isn't any more news after that. It's almost like that is the end of all news. It's like that. You don't need any more. Okay, you do need some news, but that's like the best possible news. And I think probably as evangelicals, we might over talk it so much that it becomes not very profound. We mention it all the time in a way that becomes very banal, a bit like a fridge magnet. And actually, a verse on a fridge magnet, sorry, you just don't notice it. It's just there. And actually, I think we need to sort of recover this sort of defamiliarizing of how amazing that news is and how unbelievably astounding it is. Not just by saying the same thing over and over again, maybe by being creative in how we engage with it, but pointing to, as you say, Michael, that incredible hope. It's a hope like no other. That's why when Paul says we don't grieve as those who have no hope. We actually have an incredible hope that we will actually be stepping on the shore with Christ. In heaven because of his resurrection. And it just changes your whole outlook on everything in this world. So I think focusing on the good news as a kind of filter for how we look at all news is probably a good thing to do in this as well.
I think that's a great place to bring the conversation to an end. And it occurred to me there, as both of you were talking, actually, we talked about the fact that I think, the world that television has made, the world that digital culture has made, I think there's something about news that shapes things. News changes the world, and you can either be transformed. The world can either be shaped into this model of distraction and busyness and tribalism and everything else, or Christians, we can figure out, wow, this is a broken place we're inhabiting, but we're called to take this good news, this gospel, and get out there and proclaim it. Because when we let it shape us and we are remolded in its image, then of course God can do amazing things. And so news is always going to change you. It's just a case of which news are you going to shape your life around. Well, we've covered an awful lot and in the last kind of 50 minutes. And as ever, it's just really great hanging out with you guys and talking. I hope everyone kind of listening at a home or on a bike or on a plane to Antigua or making bread or any of those kind of things has found this edifying and helpful. And if you've enjoyed the show, do tell other people about it. You spread the links. And if you've really enjoyed it, again, just look up the link to Patreon in the show notes. And we hugely value lobbing us a pound or $1, whatever, because that all helps with hosting fees and editing fees and everything else. And but otherwise, from me, Andy Bannister, and from Aaron and Michael, we will see you again in a week or so's time for another topic of relevance and importance and excitement, punctuated with bad jokes. So for me, goodbye, and see you next time.
See ya.
See ya.